The rain had been falling for 3 days over New Orleans, turning the cobblestone streets into slick rivers of oil-slick reflections. The year was 1923, and the city was still shaking off the long shadows of the Great War and the Spanish flu. It was a place where jazz spilled from smoke-filled clubs, and secrets hid in the narrow alleyways between sagging, moss-covered houses. But beneath the music and the charm, there was a rot, the kind that thrived in whispered rumors and unanswered questions. It was during one of those wet, gray mornings that the first letter arrived. The envelope was plain, the handwriting cramped but precise, and the ink smudged as if written in haste. The addressee was a local grocer named Paul Leroux, a man of little note beyond the few streets that knew him. The letter's content was short but chilling. It described, in disturbing detail, how Leroux would be found, lying face down in the gutter on Chartres Street, his skull split by a falling beam, his hands clutching at nothing. At first, Leroux laughed it off, crumpling the paper and tossing it aside. Yet 3 nights later, during a storm much like the one that had greeted the letter, he was discovered exactly as described. The beam had come loose from a sagging balcony overhead, striking him with fatal precision. Witnesses swore the scene was identical to the letter's description. By the end of the week, another letter appeared. This time, it was delivered to a seamstress named Adele Beauchamp. Her fate, according to the note, would be drowning in the murky waters of the Mississippi after her ferry capsized. She received the letter on a Tuesday. By Friday evening, the newspaper headline read, "Seamstress among dead in river tragedy." 2 deaths might have been coincidence. But the third letter, and the death that followed, sent shivers through the French Quarter. The victim, a respected banker, had no enemies anyone knew of. His letter described his body slumped over his desk, his mouth twisted in horror, his coffee poisoned. And that was exactly how he was found. Hours after the letter was opened. By then, the police were involved. Detectives speculated it might be the work of a madman, perhaps someone with a taste for theatrics. They considered the possibility that the letters were warnings, and that the sender was the very killer carrying them out. But no one saw the boy. No one even suspected a boy could be behind something so cruel. It wasn't until the 4th death that a clue appeared. A postman delivering one of the letters noticed the return address space was left blank, but the paper bore the faint scent of must and mildew, the kind found in old books and crumbling plaster. The handwriting, too, seemed odd, not quite childlike, yet not fully mature. The loops of the letters were overly neat, the strokes sharp. Experts said it was the kind of penmanship taught in orphanages, where discipline extended even to the way a child formed their letters. This detail narrowed the suspicion. In 1920s New Orleans, the city's orphanages were full to bursting, homes for children left parentless by war, disease, or poverty. Some were well run. Others, little more than warehouses for the unwanted. Among the largest was St. Augustine's, home for boys, a sprawling brick building near the edge of the quarter. It was here, police believed, they might find their letter writer, but the orphanages were tight-lipped. To accuse a child of such a thing was unthinkable, especially when no one could imagine how a boy might orchestrate deaths with such precision. And yet, as the death toll climbed, the possibility became harder to ignore. Rumors began to curl through the streets. Some claimed the letter writer was not a killer at all, but a seer, a boy cursed with visions of deaths he could not stop. Others whispered that he was the instrument of something darker, something that whispered the fates of strangers into his ear at night. These theories only deepened the city's unease. By late summer, the letters were no longer just an oddity. They were feared. People opened their mailboxes with trembling hands, praying not to see that cramped, deliberate handwriting. Every envelope without a return address was treated with suspicion. Shopkeepers locked their doors early. Superstitious families nailed sprigs of rosemary and bits of iron above their thresholds, desperate for any protection. The police, for their part, were desperate too. They began stationing plainclothes officers near post offices, hoping to catch someone, anyone, dropping off the letters. It was a waste of manpower. The letters seemed to appear out of nowhere, as though they bypassed the postal system entirely. Then came the turning point. On an overcast September morning, the chief inspector himself received one. It described, in unnerving detail, how he would die, not in the line of duty, but in his own home, in his study, by a sudden and violent fall down the stairs. He tried to dismiss it as a hoax. That evening, while reaching for a file on a high shelf, he lost his balance. Witnesses said his neck broke before he hit the bottom step. The city erupted in panic. If the chief inspector wasn't safe, no one was. The mayor demanded results, ordering police to search every orphanage, every school, every place where the faint scent of musty paper might linger. But still, the boy remained unseen. Only one person claimed to have glimpsed him, an elderly laundress who swore she saw a thin, pale child watching a funeral procession from the shadows of an alley. She described him as wearing clothes too, large for him, his eyes dark and unblinking. When she called out, he vanished into the crowd. She was certain he was no ordinary boy, though she couldn't explain why. The city began to feel like a stage set for the boy's morbid theater. No one knew who would be next, or why certain people were chosen. The randomness was part of the terror. The poor, the wealthy, the honest, the corrupt, all fell equally to his predictions. And in the flickering gaslight of the quarter's narrow streets, it was easy to believe that the boy, whoever he was, might be watching. The day after the chief inspector's funeral, New Orleans felt different. It wasn't just the gray skies or the sticky humidity clinging to the air like damp cloth. It was something heavier, something pressing on the city like a hand. The funeral had been a spectacle. People lined the streets not out of respect, but to see whether the boy would be there, hiding somewhere in the crowd. He wasn't God, at least. No one could prove he was. The police had increased their presence at every corner, yet it only seemed to make people more nervous. Officers patrolled the French Quarter in pairs, their eyes scanning doorways, balconies, and the narrow alleys that seemed to open and close like breathing lungs. Shopkeepers, who once knew every face that passed their doors, now looked with suspicion at anyone who lingered too long. And still, the letters came. The next victim was a man named Joseph Beauregard, a watchmaker known for repairing antique clocks for the city's wealthiest families. His letter described how he would be found slumped at his workbench, surrounded by shattered glass and twisted gears. The hands of every clock in his shop stopped at the exact same time, 3:15 p.m. It happened on a Tuesday. Customers arriving for their appointments found the door unlocked, but the shop silent. Inside, Beauregard's body lay exactly as written, every clock's face frozen in eerie unison. The time on the police report? 3:15 p.m. The detail was what unsettled people most. These weren't vague predictions. They were surgical in their accuracy. And with each death, the boy's legend grew. Parents began keeping their children indoors, whispering prayers at night in languages carried over from distant homelands: French, Haitian Creole, Italian. Priests preached about the wages of sin, warning that God's judgment could strike in unexpected ways. In the markets, some swore the boy was a spirit, or the devil himself in disguise. Others said he was just a messenger, delivering warnings on behalf of something far worse. The police still clung to the idea of a human culprit, but the evidence was thin. Every letter was written on the same type of rough, unbleached paper, the kind used in bulk by institutions like schools and orphanages. The ink was ordinary, the handwriting consistent, but not distinctive enough to link to one individual. Forensics in the 1920s could only go so far, and fingerprints lifted from the paper were useless. They belonged to the recipients. One detective, a wiry man named Vincent Moreau, became obsessed. He was convinced the boy was hiding in plain sight, slipping in and out of the city's edges like smoke. Moreau began spending nights on stackouts near the St. Augustine's home for boys, watching as the children filed in and out under the watchful eyes of nuns. He saw nothing unusual, no furtive trips to post boxes, no signs of secret meetings. On the third night, something caught his attention. At the very edge of the orphanage's yard stood a boy apart from the others. He didn't play, didn't talk. He simply watched. His posture was stiff, and his eyes, though too far to make out clearly, seemed fixed on Moreau's position in the shadows. And then, without a word, the boy turned and walked inside. Moreau returned the next night. But the boy wasn't there. That same week, another letter arrived, this time to a local judge. The note described the judge being crushed under a collapsed bookshelf in his study. The judge laughed off the warning, even making jokes about rearranging his library. Days later, during a violent storm, the bookshelf toppled exactly as foretold, breaking the man's spine. The press had a field day. Headlines screamed of a prophet of death haunting New Orleans. The newspapers printed partial transcriptions of the letters, much to the police's frustration. All it did was fan the flames of fear, turning the mysterious boy into something larger than life. But with notoriety came patterns, faint and almost invisible. It was the city's morgue clerk who noticed first. All the victims had lived within walking distance of one of 3 specific post offices. This suggested the letters weren't mailed from far away. They were dropped locally, and possibly by someone who avoided the main postal routes. The police began quietly watching those post offices, but the letters continued to slip past them. Sometimes, a letter would even appear on a doorstep without having gone through the postal service at all. That was when the theory shifted. Perhaps the boy was delivering them himself, and yet no one had seen him do it. Then came a strange break in the case. A letter sent to a woman named Estelle Duval arrived in an envelope that, unlike the others, bore a small water stain. It seemed unimportant, but the type of stain, circular, pale, matched the marks left by the leaky roof of the St. Augustine orphanage's west wing. Moreau seized on it, certain now that his instincts had been right all along. When the police searched the orphanage, they found nothing. No stash of paper, no bottles of ink, no hidden letters waiting to be sent. But Moreau wasn't satisfied. He spoke with the matron, Sister Bernadette, who reluctantly admitted that one boy had shown unusual behavior. His name was Louis Charbonneau, aged 12. He rarely spoke, never smiled, and seemed to know things about people he shouldn't. When a child at the orphanage died of illness, Louis had predicted it in the same detached manner one might comment on the weather. The problem was, Louis had an alibi for several of the letter deliveries. On days when some letters had been dropped, he had been accounted for at the orphanage. Still, Moreau pressed on, convinced that Louis was involved, if not directly. Then in some way, the police had yet to understand. That belief only deepened when Moreau received a letter himself. It was unlike the others. Instead of describing his death in vivid detail, it contained only one line: "You will not stop me." The words rattled him more than he cared to admit. The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting was the same. Moreau doubled his surveillance, but every lead withered into nothing. In the city at large, fear was becoming a constant hum. Businesses saw fewer customers. Families moved away from the French Quarter altogether. Superstition began to shape daily life. People refused to walk certain streets, avoided touching strange envelopes, and even burned unopened mail if it arrived without a return address. The boy, whoever he was, seemed untouchable. every attempt. To corner him ended in failure, and each failure was followed by another death by winter. The death toll had climbed into the dozens. But it wasn't the number of victims that haunted people. It was the inevitability. Once your name appeared on one of those envelopes, it was as good as carved into stone. And the most terrifying part? No one could explain how a 12-year-old orphan could hold the city in his grip like this, or why. By the start of 1924, the death letters had become part of New Orleans' identity, as inseparable from the city's lore as its music and its shadows. Tourists came hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious letter writer, though most quickly lost their fascination when they saw the fear etched into the faces of locals. The letters were no longer just a strange, morbid curiosity. They were a presence, a living dread that clung to every street corner. Detective Vincent Moreau hadn't slept properly in months. The letter he had received, "You will not stop me," was pinned to the inside of his desk drawer, where he could see it every morning. It wasn't just a warning. It felt like a taunt, as if the writer knew every step he would take before he took it. But Moreau wasn't the only one unraveling. The police force had grown restless and paranoid. Officers were ordered to open and inspect any unmarked envelopes, a policy that sparked outrage but yielded nothing useful. People began reporting suspicious children in the streets, leading to a string of false accusations and tense confrontations. Still, there were moments, brief, flickering moments, when a pattern seemed close enough to touch. One such moment came in late January, when a longshoreman named Albert Dupré received his letter. It described his death in the hold of a cargo ship, crushed beneath a shifting crate of imported stone. This prediction was disturbing enough. But what caught Moreau's attention was the paper itself. Unlike the others, this letter was written on stationery with faint, ghost-like lines running across it, lines left by a printing press that was decades out of use. A check of local suppliers revealed that only one place in the city still had access to such paper: the print room of St. Augustine's home for boys. It was an old relic of the orphanage's past, a dusty corner where children once learned to print their own reading materials. The discovery was enough for Moreau to demand another search of the orphanage. This time, he went alone, arriving just before evening prayers. The building smelled of damp wood and boiled cabbage, its halls dimly lit by oil lamps. He found Sister Bernadette in her office and told her he wanted to see the print room. Reluctantly, she led him there. The room was small, cluttered with wooden trays of type, stacks of brittle paper, and shelves sagging under the weight of ink cans. It was cold, and dust drifted in the air like gray snow. Moreau ran his fingers over the paper. Feeling the same faint texture he had noticed in Dupré's letter, he asked Sister Bernadette who used the room. She hesitated, then admitted that hardly anyone did any more, except, occasionally, Louis Charbonneau. She claimed he liked to sit in the corner, reading, though he never touched the press. Still, her voice held uncertainty, and Moreau could tell she didn't believe her own reassurance. When Moreau left the orphanage that night, he had the uneasy sense that he was being watched. As he crossed the courtyard toward the street, a movement in one of the darkened windows caught his eye. A pale face, motionless, framed in shadow. He froze, staring up at it. The boy didn't move. Then the light shifted, and the window was empty. That same week, Dupré died exactly as foretold, his body pulled from the wreckage of the cargo hold. Moreau couldn't shake the feeling that every victim was somehow chosen with care, though for reasons that remained hidden. It was around this time that another figure entered the story. A man named Dr. Félix Marchand, a professor of psychology at Tulane University. Marchand had been following the case from the beginning, fascinated by the precision of the predictions. He approached the police with an unsettling theory, that the boy might not be causing the deaths at all, but simply foreseeing them. According to Marchand, certain rare individuals experienced death visions, an involuntary awareness of when and how someone would die. If this were true, Marchand argued, then the boy's letters might not be threats, but attempts to communicate his visions. But this explanation raised an even more troubling question. Why send them? Why torment people with the knowledge of their own deaths if nothing could be done to prevent them? The theory divided the city. Some found it strangely comforting to think the boy wasn't a murderer. Others thought it made him even more dangerous, a supernatural force instead of a flesh-and-blood criminal. In early February, Moreau received word of a new letter delivered to a prominent figure, the editor of the New Orleans Gazette. This one described the man's death in his office, slumped over his typewriter as the building filled with smoke from an electrical fire. The police responded immediately, stationing officers at the Gazette's offices and installing extra fire safety measures. 3 days passed without incident, and for a moment it seemed the curse had been broken. Then, on the 4th night, the editor was found exactly as described. The fire had started not from faulty wiring, but from a lantern tipped over in an adjacent office, an accident no one had anticipated. The failure hit the police hard. If the boy could foresee deaths, even when precautions were taken, then he was operating on a level they couldn't match. Marchand, meanwhile, became more convinced of his theory and began studying orphanage records. He found that Louis Charbonneau had been admitted to St. Augustine's at age 5 after both his parents died in a tenement fire. The circumstances were odd. There were rumors that Louis had been found outside the building minutes before it collapsed, staring at it without alarm, as though he had been expecting it. Marchand tried to meet with Louis, but Sister Bernadette refused, claiming the boy was delicate and easily upset. Moreau suspected the truth was simpler. The sister didn't want outsiders near him. The city entered Lent under a shadow darker than any before. Even Mardi Gras was subdued, the usual revelry muted by the constant fear that a letter could arrive at any moment. Some people began leaving town altogether, abandoning homes and businesses. Others took a fatalistic approach, insisting that if their time came, no letter could change it. And yet, despite the atmosphere of dread, there were still those who wanted to know the truth. One night, a small group of locals, including a newspaperman, a dock worker, and a seamstress, decided to stake out the orphanage themselves. They claimed that around midnight they saw a figure slip out of the side door and vanish into the fog. The figure was small, dressed in ill-fitting clothes, and carried something tucked under one arm. They followed him as far as they could, but he seemed to dissolve into the night, disappearing down a maze of back alleys. By morning, another letter had been delivered, this one predicting the death of the dock worker who had been part of the chase. He drowned 2 days later, pulled under by the current while unloading cargo. The incident deepened the legend. People began to believe the boy could somehow sense when he was being hunted, and that he retaliated. Whether by coincidence or design, no one could say. For Moreau, the time for passive investigation was over. He decided to take a risk, one that could cost him his career. He would approach Louis Charbonneau directly, bypassing the orphanage's restrictions. If the boy truly was behind the letters, Moreau intended to see it in his eyes. But as he made his plans, a new letter appeared, and this time it bore Moreau's own name. It described him in stark detail, lying in the rain beside the Mississippi, his face turned toward the black water, a single slip of paper clutched in his hand. The date written at the bottom of the letter was only 5 days away. The letter sat on Vincent Moreau's desk like a living thing, its folds sharp, the ink dark as dried blood. He had read it a dozen times already, each time searching for some irregularity, a tremor in the handwriting, a smudge, a stray mark. Anything to prove it was a forgery or a cruel prank. But there was nothing. It was exactly like all the others. Same script, same paper, same precise, unshakable certainty. The description of his death was unnervingly detailed. The color of his coat, the tilt of his hat, the exact bend in the river where he would fall. Even the weather was described. Rain-slick streets, thunder. In the distance, the slip of paper in his hand was left deliberately vague, though Moreau suspected it would be the letter itself. He tried to remind himself that superstition had no place in police work. But the problem was, superstition didn't matter here. Facts did, and the fact was that every other letter had come true. For the first time, the case became personal in a way he couldn't detach from. It wasn't just a hunt anymore. It was a countdown. He locked the letter in his desk and went to Marchand. The psychologist listened in silence as Moreau laid the paper in front of him. Marchand's face didn't change, but there was a shift in his posture, a tightening in the shoulders, a faint narrowing of the eyes. He told Moreau, in that calm professorial way of his, that there were two possibilities. Either the boy was directly causing the deaths through some elaborate orchestration, or he was simply predicting them with unnerving accuracy. In either case, confronting him before the date in the letter could alter the outcome, though whether for better or worse was impossible to say. Moreau left Marchand's office with a decision forming in his mind. If he had 5 days, he would use them to tear through every barrier between himself and Louis Charbonneau. The first step was surveillance. He placed 2 plainclothes officers outside St. Augustine's home for boys, rotating shifts so the building was never unwatched. He also enlisted a contact at the post office, someone willing to discreetly flag any letter that matched the death letter. Style. The second step was access. St. Augustine's was a charitable institution with deep ties to both the church and the city's wealthier patrons. It was not the kind of place easily pressured by a police badge. Sister Bernadette had proven herself stubborn, even hostile, toward the idea of interference. So Moreau opted for an indirect route. One of the other nuns, Sister Claire, had a reputation for being more talkative and for visiting the market on Thursdays. Moreau found her there, inspecting vegetables under a striped awning. He didn't threaten her. He didn't have to. Instead, he spoke of the fear spreading through the city, how people were looking to the church for comfort, and how withholding the truth could damage its standing dot. It was enough to open a crack. Sister Claire admitted that Louis was different. Not troublesome, exactly, but unsettling. He spent hours in silence, rarely played with the other boys, and often sat at the window during storms, staring at the street below. He had a habit of folding scraps of paper into neat squares and tucking them into his pockets. Sometimes he was missing for hours at a time, though no one ever saw him leave. When Moreau pressed further, she hesitated, then told him something. That chilled him. Louis had once said that death is just a train on a schedule, and I can hear it coming. She claimed she had never told anyone for fear of sounding foolish. That night, Moreau dreamed of trains, endless black engines rushing toward him through the fog, their whistles screaming like distant voices. On the morning of the 4th day, another letter surfaced. This one wasn't addressed to Moreau, but to an elderly woman in the Garden District. The timing was strange. Most letters appeared days before the event, but this one predicted her death that same night. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Moreau ordered a watch on the woman's home, reasoning that if Louis truly delivered the letters himself, this might be his chance to catch him in the act. The hours dragged by under a steady drizzle. Midnight came and went with no sign of the boy. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the old woman's house caught fire. Witnesses swore the flames erupted from nowhere, as if a single spark had leapt from the air itself. The woman didn't make it out. When the fire was extinguished, Moreau walked the soaked ruins. On the blackened threshold lay a small scrap of paper, burned around the edges but still legible. It was the letter, and it had been placed there before the fire started. Back at his desk, Moreau stared at the calendar. One day left not by dawn, he had resolved to enter the orphanage without permission. If Sister Bernadette refused him again, he would force the matter. But when he arrived, he found the front gates unlocked and the doors ajar. The building was silent, the corridors empty. He moved through the halls with his hand on his revolver, his footsteps echoing off the stone. In the print room, he found something new. The press was clean, the dust disturbed, and on the work table sat a neat stack of blank envelopes. Next to them lay a small tin of black ink, still wet, and a single sheet of paper with his name written. At the top dot the rest of the letter was blank. Moreau stood frozen, unsure whether it was an unfinished threat or an invitation. Then he heard the faint creak of a floorboard behind him. Turning, he caught sight of a small figure in the doorway, pale, thin, eyes dark and unblinking. Louis Charbonneau. The boy didn't move or speak. He simply watched. A silence stretched, heavy as lead. Then Louis stepped back into the shadows and was gone. Moreau gave chase, tearing through the orphanage's halls, but the boy was nowhere. Doors led to empty rooms, staircases to deserted landings. It was as if Louis had melted into the building itself. That night, Moreau didn't go home. He walked the streets along the river, scanning every alley, every shadow. The rain came just as the letter had predicted, slicking the cobblestones until they shone like black glass. And then, in the distance, he saw him, standing by the bend in the river, exactly where the death scene in the letter had been set. The boy was facing the water, his posture calm, almost expectant. Moreau's pulse hammered in his ears as he approached. Each step felt like it was carrying him toward something inevitable, something written long before he had any say in it. When he was just a few paces away, Louis turned and looked at him, not with malice, but with the detached curiosity of someone watching a clock strike the hour. Moreau opened his mouth to speak, and then the world behind the boy seemed to ripple, as if the air itself had been disturbed. The next moment, a voice called out his name from somewhere in the dark. He turned toward it. When he looked back, Louis was gone. The rain didn't stop that night. It came down in cold sheets, soaking through Moreau's coat, running in rivulets down the narrow gutters of the French Quarter. He remained by the bend in the river, far longer than reason dictated, scanning the darkness for any trace of the boy. The lamps along the embankment flickered under the storm's breath, their yellow light bending and distorting in the wet air. Louis had been there. Moreau knew it, felt it in his bones. And yet, somehow, the boy had vanished without leaving so much as a wet footprint. By the time he returned to his apartment, dawn was crawling over the city. The rain had eased into a mist, and the streets steamed faintly in the growing light. Moreau lit a cigarette with hands that didn't quite feel steady, leaning on the window frame and staring out at the city's damp rooftops. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He was sure now that Louis was not simply guessing the details of these deaths. Whether through trickery or something stranger, the boy was present, physically or otherwise, at the edges of these events. The sensation when their eyes met by the river had been unlike anything Moreau had ever experienced in years of police work. Not the glare of a criminal caught in the act, nor the panic of someone about to run. It had been stillness, expectation. At noon, Marchand came to him unannounced. The psychologist looked drawn, as if he too had not slept. He'd been studying the letters more closely, he said, and something had begun to gnaw at him. The handwriting was too consistent. Not simply neat, precisely identical, as though each letter had been traced over a template. Marchand didn't believe a boy of 12 could maintain such mechanical perfection by accident. This brought Moreau back to the press at the orphanage. The old machine could have produced uniform type, yes, but not handwriting. That meant Louis wasn't just writing these messages. He was reproducing them. And that meant there had to be an original. A thought lodged itself deep in Moreau's mind. What if there was a master letter? A document that contained every name, every date, every detail, copied in fragments and sent out like small, lethal warnings? If that was true, then somewhere in St. Augustine's there might be a paper that told his ending in ink. Moreau decided to return to the orphanage that night, but not through the front door. He waited until the city was heavy with the smell of damp earth and river rot, then took the long, unlit streets toward the building. The iron gates were locked this time, the courtyard still. No voices from within, no light in the windows. Scaled the side wall and dropped into the yard, his boots sinking slightly in the mud. Moving along the shadows of the wall, he found a side window cracked open, the faintest breath of stale air escaping from within. Inside, the orphanage seemed even larger in the dark. The hallway swallowed the beam of his flashlight almost immediately. The stone walls damp and uneven. He passed door after door, dormitories, classrooms, storage rooms, each smelling faintly of mildew and candle wax. When he reached the print room, it was just as he'd left it, the envelopes stacked neatly, a tin of ink on the table. But now there was something else, a single sheet of paper lying in the center, weighted by a small brass key. The key looked ancient, its teeth worn smooth. The paper beneath it was blank, except for 3 words, written in that same impossibly steady hand. Read the walls, Doc. It took Moreau a moment to understand. Then he began scanning the room, the corners, the shelves, the undersides of tables. And that was when he saw them. Faint pencil markings, barely visible, scrawled along the lower edge of the west wall. At first they seemed random numbers, letters, single words, but as he moved along, the markings became more deliberate. Dates, names, short descriptions. It was a list. Some of the entries were crossed out. Others were followed by the word pending. And there, near the middle of the wall, was his own name. Beside it, the date of the next evening, the hour, and the location. The bend in the river. The description was almost word for word the same as the letter he'd received, but here it was written long before it had ever been delivered to him. A sudden noise echoed through the hall. Light, quick footsteps. Moreau snatched the key and the paper, pocketing them before swinging his flashlight toward the doorway. Nothing, only the faint sound of rain against the high windows. He forced himself to breathe, then left the room, moving deeper into the building. The key had to open something, and he suspected the answer lay in the older, unused parts of the orphanage. He found the door at the far end of the basement corridor, heavy, iron-banded, locked with a corroded padlock. The brass key turned. In it, without resistance, as though it had been used recently. Beyond was a narrow stairwell spiraling downward. The air grew colder, wetter. At the bottom was a room no larger than a prison cell, its walls lined with shelves. And on those shelves, stacked in perfect order, were dozens of small wooden boxes. Each box had a name carved into it. Some were names Moreau recognized from the investigation, victims whose deaths had matched the letters. Others were unfamiliar. There was even a box marked Vincent Moreau. His hands shook as he slid it from the shelf. Inside, resting on a bed of faded cloth, was a folded sheet of paper. He didn't open it. Not yet. Behind him, the faint sound of breathing broke the silence. He turned sharply, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and there was Louis, standing in the doorway. The boy's eyes reflected the light in a way that seemed unnatural, as though they caught more than they should. He was dry, despite the damp air. His face betrayed no emotion, but there was a kind of solemn weight in the way he looked at Moreau, as if something long expected was finally unfolding. The boy stepped into the room, moving between the shelves, his fingers brushing over the boxes. His gaze lingered on each for a heartbeat, almost like a silent acknowledgement. Moreau felt the urge to speak, to demand answers, but his voice wouldn't come. The air was too heavy, pressing against his chest. Louis stopped beside him, close enough for Moreau to smell the faint, clean scent of paper and ink. He glanced down at the box in Moreau's hands, then up into his eyes, and then he whispered something, a single, short phrase, though the words seemed to bypass Moreau's ears and lodge directly in his mind. When Moreau blinked, the boy was gone again. The room felt emptier without him, colder. Moreau stared at the box, his pulse hammering. He thought about leaving it unopened, about locking the door behind him and burning the orphanage to the ground. But the weight of the key in his pocket reminded him that it was too late for that. He unfolded the paper inside, and as his eyes moved over the words, the first tremor of true fear he'd felt in years took hold. The words on the page blurred for a moment, as if Moreau's own mind was trying to reject them. He forced himself to focus, tracing the steady, unnatural handwriting. It was his death, spelled out with surgical precision. The date, the time, the location, the same as the wall, but the letter went further than any prediction he'd seen before. It described the weather, light rain, heavy clouds, the faint smell of tobacco on the air. It noted the position of his hands when they found him. It even mentioned the color of his tie, and at the bottom, in smaller writing, were 3 words, "You will see." He stood frozen in that underground room, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. The smell of damp stone seemed sharper now, the silence thicker. A part of him wanted to tear the paper into shreds, scatter it, and pretend it never existed. But another part, the part that had driven him to follow this case, knew that destroying the evidence wouldn't change anything. He replaced the paper in the box, slid it back onto the shelf, and took one last look around the room. There were perhaps 50 boxes in all, maybe more hidden deeper in the shadows. How many of those names were still alive? How many were already cold in the ground? The brass key felt heavier in his pocket as he climbed the narrow stairwell back toward the basement corridor. The door groaned shut behind him, and for a brief moment he thought about relocking it. But the truth was, the lock meant nothing if Louis wanted to open it again. Back outside, the night had settled into a dense, oppressive fog that clung to the street lamps like cobwebs. Moreau's every step toward home felt weighted. The image of Louis in that basement stayed with him, dry despite the damp, calm despite the horror around him. When he finally reached his apartment, he sat at his desk and laid the key, the cryptic paper from the print room, and his notebook side by side. If Louis was reproducing the predictions from some original source, that source had to be in his possession, or in the possession of whoever truly controlled him. The boy could not be acting entirely alone. The question gnawed at Moreau. Was Louis a willing participant, or merely a vessel? The way he had looked at the boxes, there had been something almost mournful in it. Sleep refused him again. At some point in the early hours, he found himself wandering the streets without really knowing where he was headed. The fog had thinned, and the moonlight glistened on the wet cobblestones. That's when he saw it. A figure, small, slight, standing at the far end of the street under the halo of a gas lamp. Louis, watching him without moving. Moreau's pulse quickened. He started forward, and Louis turned, walking with that same unhurried pace that made pursuit maddening. Through the winding back alleys they went, past shuttered shops, close taverns, and the ever-present hum of the river. Finally, the boy stopped at the entrance to an old, boarded-up chapel. The wooden boards were warped and splitting. The Stained glass windows cracked into spiderwebs of darkened glass. Above the door, the stone cross was chipped and weather-worn. Louis stepped inside without a sound. Moreau hesitated only a moment before following. The interior smelled of rot and candle wax long extinguished. Moonlight filtered in through the broken windows, pooling faintly across the warped pews. At the far end, where the altar should have been, there was instead a heavy wooden desk. Upon it sat an open ledger. Louis stood behind the desk, one pale hand resting on the page. Moreau approached slowly, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The ledger was filled with the same flawless handwriting, pages and pages of it, stretching backward in time, names, dates, causes of death, and not just recent ones. Some entries were decades old. Near the top of the current page was his own name again, written in ink so fresh it still glistened. Below it were several more names he recognized from active police cases not yet solved, victims not yet dead. Louis lifted his hand from the page and pointed to the corner of the room. Moreau's eyes followed the gesture. There, sitting on a small stand, was a single sealed envelope. His own name was written across it. He didn't move to pick it up. Instead, he asked himself why the boy had led him here. Was this an invitation to learn the truth, or a final warning? Louis's gaze remained steady, unblinking. The silence between them seemed to stretch and press against Moreau's ears. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, Louis stepped away from the desk and moved toward a side door. He didn't look back. When Moreau finally approached the envelope, his hands felt cold. He broke the seal. Inside was a page torn directly from the ledger, his own entry. But beneath it, in smaller, hastier writing, were 4 words. You can still leave. It was the first message that suggested any possibility of altering the outcome. He left the chapel with the page in his coat, his thoughts a storm. If the predictions could be wrong, then the entire chain of deaths might be breakable. But how? And why warn him when so many others had died without such mercy? The next morning, he took the page to Marchand. The psychologist examined it in silence for a long time before saying that the handwriting was indeed identical to every other letter, but the ink was different, fresher, less aged than the others. Someone, somewhere, was still writing these predictions now. That night, Moreau made his decision. He would return to the orphanage at the exact time the ledger claimed he would die, not at the river bend, but inside those walls. If fate wanted him, it would have to find him there. And perhaps in that moment he could catch the hand that wrote the future. But a faint, lingering dread whispered another possibility, that by stepping into the orphanage on that night, at that hour, he would be placing himself exactly where the ledger wanted him to be. The day moved like something trapped in syrup, slow, sticky, suffocating. Every tick of the clock seemed louder, and each one pushed Moreau closer to the appointed hour in the ledger. The page from the chapel lay folded in his coat pocket, its words pressing against him like a hidden blade. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a dull, bruised gray. Clouds sagged low over New Orleans, carrying the kind of damp weight that promised rain. Moreau spent the hours pacing his apartment, then sitting at his desk, then standing again without realizing he'd moved. His thoughts spiraled endlessly. If the ledger's predictions had never been wrong, what was the logic of going against it now? Was he chasing a truth, or was he running headfirst into the exact shape of his own ending? When the time came to leave, his body felt both heavy and hollow. He dressed in dark clothes and tied the same red tie the letter had mentioned, a deliberate defiance to the fate described. He checked the revolver in his coat pocket twice, though he doubted it would matter against whatever force was at work. The orphanage was quiet when he arrived, its windows unlit and black against the deepening. Evening. A faint drizzle had begun, making the cobblestones slick and the air taste faintly of iron. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door groaned open. Inside, the smell was the same as it had been in the basement: damp wood, cold stone, and the faintest trace of mildew. Moreau moved through the hallways, his steps echoing softly. He passed the empty dormitories, the peeling classrooms, the dining hall with its long tables still lined, neatly as though awaiting a meal that would never come. He descended to the basement and unlocked the hidden door again. The underground archive looked unchanged, but tonight it felt heavier, as if the air itself knew what was supposed to happen here. The boxes were shadows on shadows. He checked his watch. The ledger had marked the time for precisely 10 minutes past 9. It was 9:04. 6 minutes left. Moreau positioned himself near the shelves, facing the stairwell. If someone came to write in the ledger or deliver a letter, they would have to pass by him. His eyes adjusted further to the gloom, catching the faint glint of moisture on the stone walls. At 9:07, the faint creak of a door reached him from somewhere above. His pulse spiked. He tightened his grip on the revolver, every muscle coiled. The sound of footsteps followed, slow, deliberate, descending. At 9:09, the figure appeared at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't Louis. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in an old-fashioned black coat. His face was pale and long, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut. In one hand, he held a small leather-bound book. In the other, a fountain pen that gleamed even in the dim light. He looked at Moreau without surprise, as though he had expected him to be there. Then, without a word, he stepped to a small writing desk in the corner. He opened the book, the ledger, and dipped the pen into an inkwell that seemed to appear from nowhere. Moreau stepped forward, gun raised, demanding he stop. The man didn't even glance up. Instead, his hand began to move, the pen scratching across the page with unnerving speed. At 9:10, the man finished writing, closed the ledger, and set the pen down. He looked at Moreau with an expression that was neither malice nor kindness, but something colder, inevitability. And then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "It is written." The lights, though Moreau could not remember there being any lit, seemed to flicker. A rush of cold air swept through the basement, carrying with it the sound of distant, rushing water. The man turned and began ascending the stairs. The ledger under his arm. Moreau shouted after him, but his voice sounded muffled, as though the walls were swallowing it. He gave chase, but when he reached the upper hall, the man was gone. The building felt wrong now, the shadows deeper, the air heavier. Moreau checked his watch. 9:10 exactly. His death, according to the ledger, should be happening now. Every instinct told him to flee, but his legs carried him deeper into the orphanage instead, searching for Louis, for answers, for anything. He passed by the old chapel connected to the orphanage. Something inside drew him. The door was ajar, and beyond it, candles burned in the dark, though he hadn't lit them. Their light cast long, twisting shadows across the cracked floor. At the center of the chapel stood Louis. The boy's expression was unreadable, but his eyes glistened in the flickering light. He was holding another envelope, this one sealed with black wax. Moreau approached, the revolver still in his hand, though it felt absurd now. Louis extended the envelope without a word. Inside was another letter, short, only one line. Not tonight. Moreau looked up, but Louis was already stepping backward toward a side door. The chapel door slammed shut behind him. The candles flickered violently, and for a moment, the sound of rushing water filled the room again. Moreau turned in a slow circle, the walls pressing in around him. Then, just as suddenly, the sensation passed. The chapel was silent again, the air still. When he stepped outside into the rain, it was 9:14. He was alive. The knowledge should have brought relief, but instead it left him unsettled. Someone, whether Louis or the tall man or both, had the power to decide who lived and died. And tonight they had chosen to spare him. The question that clawed at him now was, why? That night, Moreau couldn't bring himself to return home. Instead, he walked the city until dawn, turning over the events in his mind. The ledger was real. The predictions were being written, actively, now, in the present, by someone other than Louis. But Louis was still deeply entangled, acting as a messenger, perhaps even a guardian of sorts. If he was to end this, to end the chain of deaths, he would need to find out who the tall man was, and how he had come to hold the ledger. But part of him feared the answer might be older, darker, and far less human than any killer he'd ever pursued. The rain had stopped by the time the sun began bleeding its dull orange light over New Orleans. The streets steamed faintly, the gutters carrying away the last of the night's filth. Moreau hadn't slept. His clothes were damp and stiff from the weather, and his mind felt like a tangled spool of wire, sharp in places, but impossible to straighten. The image of the tall man in the basement wouldn't leave him. There had been no surprise in his face, no panic at seeing a gun aimed at him, only that hollow certainty. It was the same kind of expression Moreau had seen on condemned men who had long since made peace with their fate by mid-morning. He was back in his apartment, seated at his desk with a single lamp casting a pale pool of light over a growing stack of notes. He'd begun making a list of every detail he could remember. The man's clothing, his voice, the curve of his handwriting. The words he had spoken, "It is written," were underlined 3 times. It was a phrase drenched in finality, not threat. As though the act of writing was not a choice, but an execution of something inevitable. Moreau's investigation instincts told him to start with something concrete. The ledger was physical, tangible, bound in leather. Books could be traced to sellers, to collectors, to archives. But his gut told him the trail wouldn't be that simple. The orphanage records had yielded nothing about the ledger before. If it had a history, it might not exist in official channels at all. That afternoon, he made his way to the city's oldest bookshop, a narrow, sagging structure tucked between a pawn shop and a shuttered apothecary. Inside, the air was thick, with the scent of dust and paper. The owner, a hunched man with thin spectacles and an unblinking gaze, listened quietly as Moreau described the ledger. "A book that writes death," the man said finally, voice flat. "I've heard of it. Not that one, perhaps. But others. Old things. Dangerous things. They change hands quietly. No one ever admits to owning them." When Moreau asked for names, the man shook his head. "They don't have names, you'd know. If they have names at all, they've forgotten them." Then, leaning in, "If you've seen one, you're already in its pages." The words clung to Moreau long after he left the shop. That night, sleep came in fits. His dreams were thick with water, black rivers spilling through the streets, voices murmuring beneath the surface. Somewhere in the current, Louis drifted, his pale face turned upward, eyes open but unseeing. He woke with a taste of salt on his tongue and the steady thud of his heart loud in his ears. The next day, he turned his attention to Louis. If the boy wasn't the one writing the deaths anymore, if he ever had, then his role now was one of messenger or witness, which meant he had to be getting instructions from somewhere. Following Louis meant returning to the edges of the city's underbelly. Moreau found him just past dusk, lingering near the old docks, watching the river with that same unblinking calm he'd worn in the chapel. The boy moved through the streets like smoke, slipping between groups of strangers, darting down alleys, never lingering in the open. Moreau trailed him for hours, until Louis reached a derelict row house in the Coes Treme district. Its windows were boarded, and the front steps sagged like they might collapse under weight. Louis glanced over his shoulder once, not at Moreau, but at the street itself, then slipped inside. Moreau waited several minutes before following. The air inside was stale and bitter with rot. The floorboards creaked under his boots. Faint light seeped from a room at the back, its source hidden. From the doorway, Moreau saw Louis kneeling before a low table. On the table lay an envelope, sealed in black wax, identical to the one he had handed over in the chapel. Louis lifted it reverently, as though it weighed far more than paper should, and placed it in a wooden box beside two others. Moreau's attention shifted to the corner of the room. There, in the dim light, sat another man. Not the tall one from the orphanage. This one was heavier, his hair silver, his eyes small and sharp. He was watching Louis like a priest overseeing ritual. The man's gaze flicked up, meeting Moreau's. There was no surprise, only a faint smile. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Moreau stepped into the room, keeping the wall at his back. His voice was steady when he asked who they were. The man leaned back in his chair. "We are caretakers, nothing more. The ledger has always been, and it will always be. We simply make sure the words reach their marks." He nodded toward Louis. "The boy delivers them. It is not his burden to question." "Nor yours." Moreau asked about the tall man, the one writing the deaths. The caretaker's smile thinned. "You saw him?" He sounded almost impressed. "Not many do." "He doesn't. Write for everyone. Only those who matter." The word matter lodged like a splinter. When Moreau pressed further, the caretaker's tone hardened. "You think you're chasing a man. You're not. You're chasing a current. You can't stop a river by shooting at the water." The metaphor didn't comfort him. Before Moreau could say more, Louis rose, the box of letters cradled in his arms. He brushed past without looking at him, and the caretaker followed. They left through a door the back of the row house, disappearing into the night. By the time Moreau reached the alley outside, they were gone. He stood there for a long time, the rain beginning again, fine and cold. His revolver felt absurdly small in his coat pocket, a tool meant for flesh and bone, not whatever machinery of fate he was circling. Back in his apartment, he wrote everything down: the caretaker, the box of letters, the strange reverence with which Louis had handled them. The ledger wasn't just one man's work. It was a system, a network of hands, each playing its part without question. And if the tall man was the one who decided what was written, then Louis and the caretaker were his intermediaries. Which meant Moreau's next step was clear. He had to find the tall man again. Not wait for him in the orphanage, not stumble upon him by chance, but hunt him directly. The problem was, you couldn't track someone who existed only in the moments they chose to appear. But maybe, just maybe, you could bait them. Moreau's eyes went to the folded page from the chapel, still tucked into his desk drawer. "You will die on the 14th at 9:10, in the basement of the orphanage. What if he made it look like he intended to die somewhere else? Somewhere so deliberate, so loud, that the one writing the ledger would have to intervene? The idea had danger carved into its bones, but so did every other path left to him. By dawn, he'd already chosen the place. The morning air carried the kind of cold that sank into the bones, though New Orleans winters were never harsh enough to frost the windows. Moreau moved through it quickly, his coat collar turned high, the brim of his hat low over his eyes. Had not slept. The plan had kept him awake, not because of its complexity, but because of the gamble it represented. The ledger's author, whoever or whatever he was, wrote death with the confidence of someone who knew its inevitability. If Moreau could disrupt that, force his presence into a place and time not foretold. Perhaps he could pull the writer out of whatever shadowed place he worked from. The bait would be a public one. Moreau spent the morning weaving a rumor. It began in a dockside bar and spread, like all rumors do, by the lips of drunkards eager to sound like they knew more than they did. The story was simple. A certain detective, rattled by his latest case, had taken to carrying a small fortune in bribe money for a key witness. He'd be meeting the man 2 nights from now in the upper rooms of the St. Denis Hotel, under the cover of darkness. By midday, Moreau had repeated it enough to the right ears that he was certain it would find its way to the wrong ones. In this city, you could buy bread more easily than you could keep a secret. The next step was to make it look real. He reserved the room under a false name, filled a battered satchel with neatly stacked but worthless paper, and made a point of being seen going in and out of the hotel twice that afternoon. He even let himself be followed, once by a man who couldn't hide the bulge of a pistol under his jacket, once by a woman with a limp that seemed suddenly absent when she thought. She was UNOBSERVED. By nightfall, the city was already turning the rumor into truth. That was the way of things in New Orleans. If enough people believed it, it might as well be real. The day before the meeting, Moreau waited for the letter. He expected it the way a condemned man might expect a priest, inevitable, unwanted, yet strangely reassuring in its consistency. It arrived late, as all the others had, hand-delivered in a black wax-sealed envelope slipped under his door. The handwriting was as perfect as ever. You will die on the 12th. At midnight, in room 6 of the St. Denis Hotel. Moreau felt a grim satisfaction. The bait had been taken. But the date was wrong, 2 days earlier than the false meeting he'd spread word about. That, he realized, was the point. The ledger's writer was not bound to Moreau's plans. He would decide the when and the where, and perhaps the how. It was dangerous. But it was also the first time Moreau felt he was close enough to touch the hand behind the words. He spent the next day in preparation. His revolver was cleaned and loaded, but he also armed himself with patience and silence, 2 weapons far sharper than bullets in a hunt like this. He scouted the hotel, memorizing its stairwells, its side exits, the creak of its floorboards. Room 6 was on the 2nd floor, at the far end of a dim hallway. Its single window looked out onto a narrow alley between the hotel and a brick tenement, a space so tight it rarely saw daylight. When midnight came, he was already inside the room, a satchel of worthless paper placed prominently on the bed. The lamp was turned low, the air thick with the faint scent of stale tobacco and mildew. He left the door unlocked, a silent invitation. For the first hour, there was nothing. Just the occasional groan of the building settling, the faraway clink of glass from the bar below. At 1 o'clock, the doorknob turned. Moreau's grip tightened on his revolver, but he didn't move. The door eased open, letting in a sliver of hallway light. A figure slipped inside. Not the tall man, but Louis. The boy's face was expressionless as he closed the door behind him. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the satchel on the bed. Then his gaze shifted to Moreau. "You shouldn't be here," Louis said softly. Moreau didn't speak. He let the silence stretch until it felt like a weight pressing down on the air. Louis finally stepped forward, pulling something from the pocket of his coat. It was another envelope, black wax already cracked, as though it had been opened and read. He placed it on the bed beside the SATCHEL. Moreau glanced at it, but didn't reach for it. "He knows you're trying to find him," Louis continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You won't, not this way," Moreau asked. "Then how?" "They." Boy's eyes flickered, and for a moment, something like fear passed over his face. "You have to be written in," he said. "That's the only way." Before Moreau could press him, The doorknob turned again. This time, the figure who entered filled the doorway. The tall man, his shadow spilling into the room like dark water. The same neat black coat, the same pale, hollow face. He looked, first at Louis, then at Moreau, as if assessing the balance of a scale. "You've been persistent," he said at last. His voice was calm, measured. Most try to run from the words. You keep walking toward them. Moreau's revolver was in his hand now, though the tall man didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. "Why me?" Moreau asked. "Because you matter," the man replied simply. "Not to you, perhaps, but to the page." The words carried the same cold inevitability as before. "You think you can change it?" the man continued. "Every name I write dies when I say they will. The place, the time, all fixed. The ink is the world's spine. You break it, and everything collapses." Moreau said nothing. He was close enough now to see the faint smudge of ink on the man's fingers. The tall man's gaze drifted to the satchel. "You baited me," he said, almost with amusement. "And here we are. Now what? Do you shoot me? Do you think that changes your date?" Moreau tightened his grip, but something in the man's voice made him hesitate. There was no fear, no urgency, just the steady certainty of someone who had already seen the ending. "You don't understand?" the tall man said. "This isn't about me. I'm just the one who holds the pen. The hand belongs to something else." The sentence lodged in Moreau's mind like a hook. But before he could ask what, the man stepped back into the hallway. Louis followed without, looking at him by the time Moreau reached the door. The hall was empty. The room felt heavier now, the air thick as if the walls themselves had soaked up the words spoken inside it. On the bed, the second envelope still waited. He opened it with care. Inside was a single line, written in that same precise hand. "This was not your night." Beneath it, another line, but soon. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, though whether from his grip or the words themselves, he couldn't tell. He folded it and slipped it into his coat. If the man was only the pen, then somewhere there was a hand, and if there was a hand, there was a body. And bodies could be found, but the hunt had just shifted into something darker than Moreau had planned for. The days after the St. Denis Hotel felt strangely suspended, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The streets carried their usual noise, the call of vendors, the clop of horses, the bark of riverfront foremen, but beneath it was an undercurrent Moreau could not ignore. It was the feeling that something had acknowledged him and chosen to wait. He could not stop replaying the tall man's words. "I'm just the one who holds the pen." The hand belongs to something else. Moreau had hunted murderers, swindlers, and ghosts in human skin before, but the idea that the ledger was not a man's invention, that it could be an instrument of something larger, something unseen, changed everything. It stripped the case of the comfort of logic. And without logic, even his training began to feel like a flimsy shield. Yet he was not ready to let go. He began where all investigations do, with paper. He laid out every letter he'd received, each one carefully unfolded and pressed flat on. The desk in his room. They were identical in size and weight, the ink deep and even, with no blotting or smudges, except the faint ones near the bottom, where a hand might rest during writing. He studied the dates, the order, the accuracy of each prediction. The handwriting was perfectly consistent, more consistent than human muscle could sustain over time. He compared them to known samples, from police archives and private collections. Nothing matched. The more he looked, the more the words seemed to resist him. There was an odd permanence in the ink, as though it were absorbed deeper than the paper surface. Under lamplight, the black had an undertone of dark blue, the kind produced by dyes he'd never seen in the city. It was then he noticed something new. On the back of one letter, the first, dated months ago, a faint indentation barely visible unless the paper was held at an angle. Not writing, but a mark, 3 lines converging to a point, like the top of a trident. He searched the others. The mark was on all of them. Always faint, always pressed rather than einked. It was not a printer's emblem. He checked. No stationery maker in the region, nor in the wider South, used such a symbol. Whatever it was, it had been pressed into the paper after the letters were written, as if sealing them in more ways than the wax. That symbol became his key. He took it to an archivist he trusted at the city's historical society, a man who owed him favors and had a taste for the obscure. The archivist's face tightened as soon as he saw it. He led Moreau into a back room lined with shelves of brittle documents, where he pulled a leather-bound ledger from the top row. It was an inventory of artifacts seized from a French shipwreck in 1812. On the second page, pressed into the parchment, was the same trident mark, listed only as emblem on foreign correspondence, origin unknown. The notes described the find, a locked chest containing nothing but hundreds of blank sheets, each bearing the emblem, each in pristine condition despite their age. The chest had disappeared from the Society's holdings sometime in the 1880s. No thief had been caught. The archivist didn't know where it had gone, but the implication was clear. Whoever wrote the death letters had access to that paper, perhaps even the whole chest. And if the paper had survived seawater and decades without yellowing, perhaps it could carry ink in ways no ordinary sheet could. Moreau's mind returned to the tall man's fingers, smudged with that deep blue black. The ink and the paper were part of the same strange inheritance. The next question was harder. Where did the paper go after the theft? Moreau began haunting pawn shops, print shops, and the quiet back rooms where collectors of oddities gathered. He asked without asking, offering enough coins to keep mouths open, but not so much that they sensed desperation. Eventually, in a cramped second-floor shop on Chartres Street, he met a bookseller who remembered selling a small bundle of old maritime paper to a man about a year ago. The bookseller described him in detail, without needing prompting. Tall, pale, precise in speech, always wearing gloves. It was confirmation, but it was not location. Still, it was a start. The bookseller also remembered the man had asked for ink. That doesn't fade. Moreau followed that trail through stationers and apothecaries until it led him to a small, dimly lit chemist's shop on the edge of Treem. The proprietor hesitated before answering Moreau's questions, but the weight of a silver coin and the sight of his badge loosened his tongue. Yes, he'd sold ink to such a man, but only once. The man had seemed disappointed, saying it wasn't strong enough, and never returned. The chemist, however, recalled something else. The smell. Not of the man, but of his coat. It carried the sharp, mineral tang of river mud. Not the Mississippi's? Silt, the chemist insisted, but something older, staler, like the kind dredged up from the bottoms of forgotten canals. The image stayed with Moreau as he left. In New Orleans, the Mississippi was the city's vein, but its body was stitched with canals, some dry, some buried, some still whispering underfoot in places the maps had given up on. That night, he took to walking the levees and the half-forgotten paths behind the warehouses. He avoided the lit streets, listening instead for the stillness that comes before an ambush. He saw no tall man, no Louis, but twice he caught the sound of footsteps falling into rhythm with his own, then breaking away when he stopped. They were watching. The letters confirmed it. Another arrived the next morning, earlier than usual, left not under his door, but on the pillow beside him as he slept. He hadn't heard the door open. It read, "The river remembers its dead. No date, no time, no name. Just the trident mark, pressed. Deep enough to warp the paper. It felt less like a prediction and more like a summons. Moreau knew then that the hunt would not end in a room or a street. It would end where the city touched water, in the damp lungs beneath its skin. He began gathering what he would need: a lantern that could cut fog, a knife he could trust more than a gun in tight quarters, and a small notebook to record what he found. He left copies of his notes with a man at the precinct he could rely on, instructing him to open them only if Moreau failed to return within 3 days. By the third night, he was ready. He followed the smell the chemist had described, that sharp mineral tang, until it brought him to the mouth of an old canal cut off from the river decades ago. The water was low, black with silt, the air thick with the scent of rot. On the far side, half hidden under the skeletal frame of a collapsed pier, was a narrow opening in the brickwork. It was just large enough for a man to slip through. Moreau lowered himself into the water, its cold closing around his legs. The lantern's beam caught on brick slick with algae and something else, ink-dark stains that trailed inward, like the remains of a spill too thick to wash away. Inside, the tunnel swallowed sound. Every drip echoed, every movement sent ripples. Along the surface, Moreau's boots found uneven footing on submerged stone. He moved forward, the trident mark flashing in his mind with every step. Somewhere ahead, beyond the curve of the tunnel, he thought he saw the faintest glow, steady, unnatural, like lamplight burning where no street had ever run. And then, from that direction, came the sound, the slow, deliberate scratch of pen. On paper, it was not hurried, it was not hesitant. It was the measured hand of someone writing exactly what must be written. Moreau gripped the knife tighter and kept moving toward the sound. The tunnel tightened as Moreau advanced, its brickwork curving inward like the ribs of some drowned beast. The light ahead was steady, but faint, so that each step forward seemed to lengthen the distance rather than close it. His lanterns. Glow slid over slick walls and caught the gleam of water pooling in depressions in the stone. The smell of mineral and decay grew sharper, until it was not just in his nose, but clinging to his tongue. The sound of the pen was clearer now. Scratch. Pause, scratch. A rhythm not unlike breathing. Moreau moved with his own breath held, his boots barely disturbing the surface. Every instinct screamed to keep silent. The tunnel opened abruptly into a wider chamber, an old water control room from the city's early canal days. Rotted beams hung overhead, their iron fixtures crusted with rust and salt. In the center, under a lone oil lamp burning low, sat a table. The figure hunched over it was tall, impossibly still except for his hand. The tall man? He wore the same dark coat, though here, in the sickly yellow light, it looked older, almost threadbare, as if it had soaked up every damp and shadow of the place. Before him lay sheets of that same uncanny paper, their surfaces stark white against the gloom. His hand moved with the same precision Moreau had seen in the letters, each stroke of the pen deliberate, final. On the table, beside the papers, sat the small chest Moreau had read about in the shipwreck archives. Its brass fittings were tarnished to green, but the trident emblem on its lid was clear, raised like a brand. Moreau's eyes scanned the walls. They were covered completely, covered in letters, pinned with nails, pasted in place with what looked like dried paste or resin. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, each one bearing a name, a date, and the unyielding prediction of a death. The oldest were yellowed only slightly, as if time had slowed for them. The newest looked as fresh as if they'd been written minutes ago. The tall man did not turn as Moreau approached. "You've been following the wrong trail," the man said at last, his voice low, almost conversational. "You've been chasing a writer. But I told you, I'm not the hand." Moreau kept his knife ready, his eyes flicking between the man and the chest. The man dipped his pen into a squat glass bottle of ink. The liquid inside shimmered like oil. On water, catching colors the lantern could not explain. The paper, the man continued, knows. It came from a place where death was not an end, but a language. The ink listens. I translate. He finished the line he was writing and set the pen down. Sometimes it tells me of deaths far away. Sometimes it tells me of those near. And sometimes, he tapped the page with one long finger. It tells me of the one standing in the room with me. Moreau stepped closer, enough to see the page's words. Detective Henry Moreau. Found in the waters of the old canal. Lantern. Extinguished. Knife still in hand. The date was tonight's. Moreau's pulse kicked hard, but he did not lunge. Not yet. You choose this, he said. You could put down the pen. The man's pale eyes finally met his. Could you stop? Breathing? It was not bravado. It was certainty. Moreau's mind ran through the scene. The knife, the lamp, the table, the chest. If the paper and ink were the source, then breaking them might end whatever this was. But the man sat between Moreau and that chest, his long frame poised to block a reach. There was no time for careful moves. Moreau lunged, not for the man, but for the lamp. His hand knocked it sideways, spilling oil and flame across the table. The papers nearest the edge curled instantly, blackening, their trident marks warping in the heat dot. The tall man's calm shattered. He rose with startling speed, the pen in his hand like a blade. His other hand seized Moreau's coat, shoving him back toward the waterlogged edge of the chamber. The knife in Moreau's grip flashed, slicing across the man's forearm. Dark ink, not blood, welled from the cut and dripped onto the floor in thick drops. The man hissed, not in pain, but in something like fury, and tried to push Moreau into the canal's black water. Moreau twisted, driving his shoulder in two. A man's chest. They crashed into the table, scattering paper, flame, and ink. The chest slid toward the edge. Moreau saw his chance. With all the force he could gather, he kicked the chest into the water. It hit with a heavy splash and sank without a trace. The man froze. The pen fell from his hand, landing silently on the sodden floor. His shoulders slumped as if some invisible tether had been cut. Moreau backed away, knife still raised. The letters on the walls began to curl, their ink bleeding outward until each page was a dark blur. The smell of the mineral tang deepened, and the lantern's flame sputtered as if the air itself were shifting. The tall man looked at his empty hands, then at Moreau. It's gone, he said quietly. Not fear, not anger, something emptier. You've taken the voice. Moreau kept moving toward the tunnel, not trusting the stillness. He glanced back only once. The man had sunk into the chair, his long fingers tracing invisible lines on the table. Without the chest, without the paper, he looked smaller, as if whatever had filled him was now leaking away. The way out was darker than before. His lantern guttered low, but he didn't dare stop to tend it. The tunnel felt longer, the air heavier. Each step was a fight against the urge to turn and see if footsteps followed. When at last he emerged into the night air, the city sounds rushed in, the creak of barges, the distant call of a ferry whistle. The stars overhead seemed sharper than usual, as if the sky had been waiting for him to come back. In the days that followed, no more letters came. The city moved on, as it always did, but whispers about the death letters faded only slowly. Some said the writer had died. Others claimed he'd left the city for new hunting grounds. Moreau wrote his own report, the version fit for official records. But he kept a private account, one he stored far from prying eyes. He wrote about the paper that did not age, the ink that bled like blood, and the trident mark pressed deeper than any hand could manage. He never found the chest. Divers searched, but the old canal's bottom was thick with centuries of silt. Whatever lay there was buried, perhaps for good. But sometimes, late at night, Moreau swore he could still smell that mineral tongue drifting in from the water. On more than one occasion, he woke to find his own writing desk neatly arranged, with a single blank sheet of paper resting at the center white, perfect, waiting.